Someone told me that they thought that Waldorf education had been a major pillar of kind of your philosophical outlook on life, and I'd like to learn more about Waldorf. What is it? What is Waldorf education about?
I'm not particularly well grounded to give you that, except that all my grandchildren have been in Waldorf schools. So I've had a chance, and my daughter teaches in a Waldorf school. And in fact, my daughter-in-law teaches in one, so I hear a lot about it.
What do you like about it?
Well, I like the fact that they do not neglect the spiritual side of the children. It's not sectarian, religious, it's spiritual.
What's the difference?
They try to, for example, they also have a chronological approach to education. They take a balance between what a student would do in his development anthropologically. They don't teach reading so early because they say that's a conceptual thing. They don't teach math so early because that's conceptual. Instead, they teach fairy tales, mysteries, legendary things, spiritual stories, sensations, ceremony, rituals, and focusing on a center theme of a thing and bringing things into it. And also they have the idea of having one teacher start with the students and take them through 8 grades, if it works out, and often it does. That's more like music teaching, you know, so you grow with the student. Sometimes they do things I don't understand. Well, I don't understand the reasons for some things they do, but the results almost always are good. So I argue some with my daughter just for the sake of poking into things, but I really think it's a wonderful educational concept. They don't necessarily coincide with Suzuki, because Suzuki believes in starting instrumental training early. They believe only that the child should learn singing and then tonette and recorders and gradually add on the difficult instruments. But and also they don't encourage computers in the early grades. They don't encourage anything that's plastic or manufactured, or they're pretty. I should have one of my children explain it. They can do it better than I do.
The other thing is that they have little projects like embroidery or needlepoint or things like that, which I think is so great for fine motor skills, and they love it. They think that's a great, fun thing to do.
All my grandsons and granddaughters are expert knitters. I'm amazed they can just knit a doll that looks like a professional job for it, and it's also good for their sense of patience, because they not only keep their hands active, but they have to learn if you drop a stitch, you don't lie down and cry about it, you just drop it and start over again, and you don't build a product in quickly. You have to take time. When they start out on the scarf, they see it progressing step at a time. So I think that knitting is a splendid idea, and there's so many things like that that are good to do in education, and I think are somewhat different from the Montessori approach, which is more mentally adjusted. When we used to have kids come out to the nature trail, which my wife and I ran on our place, she always used to say, I can always tell when the Montessori kids come out. I said, how do you tell? She said, well, the Waldorf kids are interested in the beauty of the flower and how it smells and where it grows and how all of that sort of thing about it. The Montessori kids come out and say, that's a genus Scapularia. They knew the names of things and the intellectual facts about them, but they were missing some of the sensuous qualities that were surrounding that object, whatever it was.
So yeah, it's very interesting to see these different educational philosophies and see if there's common ground, or again to pull out the good in all of them.
Well, I think there's common ground without doubt, but there are also some essential divergencies. And that's true in the adaptation of Suzuki to the musical scene. When Paul Rowland was active in teaching, I was a good friend of his in the early days. We were both in Illinois, and he was, of course, working out his own systematic approach to pedagogy. And he died, unfortunately, when he was a relatively young person. And some of his disciples thought, well, this is a good chance to integrate. So they give workshops on Suzuki, ball rolling, and Orff, and try to pull all those three together, or Kodai or something. And I watched it for a while, and then I asked myself, how could they be, at their age, how could they be trained in both those methods, Roland and Suzuki? And I found out they would just do one or the other and introduce a couple of ideas. So I talked to some of them and said, why do you feel you have to integrate those? Why can't they be each one creating its own ambiance as it goes along? And because there's certain, if you accept certain presumptions about Suzuki, then there's things that Paul Rolls that won't work in that setting, and vice versa. Especially having to do with the selection of literature in relation to the technical aspects. You can't do taka taka thought thump and use it on Paul Roland's pieces, because they don't work on that. They weren't intended to. He was intending to do this kind of an approach to playing, which has its own validity. But you can't play Twinkle Twinkle with that kind of a stroke and make it come out right. So I tried to persuade the teachers who were doing that, go ahead and do your own thing. And if you find something that integrates, use it. But be careful you're not starting the student on two entirely different approaches to bowing, for example, which is just going to get him mixed up. Later on, you can do any kind of bowing. You're flexible. You can introduce methods from the most divergent. But in the early stages, it seemed to me that stepwise building has to be done with certain building blocks at first. But Paul and I used to discuss that, because he said one of his students went out and just had a terrible time. He was trying to teach Suzuki. And he said, why do the Suzuki people have to be so clannish and so just doing their own thing? He says, why can't they be eclectic? And I think part of the answer was that they could be eclectic, but they wouldn't have much validity in either. They'd have a foot in both camps, and they wouldn't be able to clarify as they went along. And that student eventually had to quit the job because the parents said, this is not Suzuki. And the parents were right. But what was the problem was they were trying to label things and not just do things the way they wanted to. I thought teachers should teach the way they want to, but not try to inject some other thing onto it to make it sound respectable. I had a symphony player from St. Louis come over one time and said, I want to start a Suzuki program in St. Louis, and I just want to get your ideas about how I should start the program. He said, I'm going to use Sevchek as a beginning book, and I'm not going to have any records. I won't have the parents come to the lessons, because they just get in the way, and I won't let the student listen to any recordings. And I said, well, why do you want to call it a Suzuki method? Those are all kind of principles of the Suzuki. He said, well, that's what the parents are asking for, Suzuki. So I said, well, you can go ahead and do it, but you're going to run into dissatisfaction when the parents realize that you're not teaching what you set out to do. So I said, why don't you just start a Jones Suzuki school, or a Jones violin school for young violinists, and teach any way you want to. But you don't need to use the Suzuki name just to make it respectable. And so he did that, actually. He didn't use Suzuki.